Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Right Talk presented to you by the Tolson's Historic Chapel and School. As you know, we are intending to share with you authors who have found joy, sometimes interesting and sensitive material about Washington County, and we wanted to share it with you. We have someone with us today, another author, James Rada, and we're going to be talking with him in a minute. We want you to know that today we're going to come to you from the Miller House, which is the home of the Historical Society in Washington County. I always love the historical societies, and I bet you do too. And this particular house has three different exhibits that they want to call your attention to. Now, one is the professional baseball that was conducted here in the county. I don't know whether people know about it, but we did have professional baseball here. The other is a special exhibit on the life and collections of Doug Bast. And we all appreciate him. If anyone has ever come through Washington County, been to Boonesboro, you know the vast collection that this man has put together. And so I kind of think it's an honor to know that his collection is being exhibited here at the Miller House. And the other is Bell Pottery exhibit. And so anyway, the thing is, if you're in Washington County, come on by. That's what they want you to do. Come on by and see it. So again, we welcome you from Tolson's Chapel, and we want you to know that at any time you may connect with us at tolsonschapel.org. We ask if you care to make a donation that you do. You may find all that information there at tolsonschapel.org. And now we're going to begin with our author for today, and it's James Rada. He's sitting right here beside me. He's been listening to everything. So, James, are you ready?
Sure.
I know you are. So let's talk about your book. First of all, here is the book. Secrets of Washington County. Then it says little known histories, little known stories, and hidden history, where Western Maryland starts. So here's his book, and we hope that we'll find this. Apparently, there are many of his books on bookshelves. So, how many books altogether?
Right now, there are 30 that are in print. I've got a couple that are out of print.
30 in print, and how many more out of print?
Probably 2 or 3 that are out of print right now.
Oh, okay. So you see, he's a prolific writer, is what I want you to know. And he takes his time to investigate everything that you and I would probably walk past and not even know about. So what we want to know now is what in this wonderful book that you've chosen is perhaps your most fanciful story. And can you share it with us?
Fanciful story?
Yes, because you have some. I'm looking at the book, you have some.
My favorite story in there is the story about how the county had the only albino bullfrog colony in the world. And I just thought that was interesting. Number one, that somebody would go to the trouble to raise albino bullfrogs and how he was able to collect them from as tadpoles. And the very thing that would get them killed as tadpoles was what allowed him to find them in the first place and save them.
Which would be?
Their albinism.
That's what saved them.
Yeah, when they're white tadpoles, they're very obvious to fish who would, snack on them.
Right.
But he happened to see them and realize what they were, and he saved them.
Yeah, that's unusual in and of itself, because usually the albino animals are the ones that we tend to give our attention to because they're rare, So so that,
and that's why they're rare. They usually wind up getting killed in the wild because of being albinos. They become very obvious.
Of course, I mean, you're a moose, and all of a sudden you see an albino moose. I think it would, call your attention to it, don't you think? Okay. Well, I'm looking at some other wonderful stories here, and I noticed that you did talk about Boonesboro in your book. Tell us a little bit about what you discovered as a little-known story or history of Boonesboro.
Well, Boonesboro was just an interesting town. Uh, it's one of the older towns. It was at one point considered as a possible site in the national capital.
Oh, that's right.
It's also considered the birthplace of Macadam Road, paved roads in the country.
Oh, okay.
Of
Oh,
course, it was involved in the Battle of Antietam and the Washington Monument. Washington County's Washington Monument was built very near there, which was it wasn't the first Washington Monument started, but it was the first one completed and dedicated to George Washington.
well, where did the name Boonesboro come from?
That, I believe, if I'm remembering right, came from the family who founded it. And a lot of towns back then were, named after their founders.
True.
William Boone
Uh-huh.
was the founder, and he's the one credited with having it be named after. I think people used to say it was named after Daniel.
That's what I'm sure people
But
are thinking.
yeah,
Is that true?
no,
Okay, but it makes a good story.
yes,
Okay, you might want to place that under hidden stories that never happened, but people wished were true.
it's like the old movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance with Jimmy Stewart, where there's a line in there. The newspaper editor tells Jimmy Stewart, "When the legend becomes the fact, print the legend."
Ah, very true. I like that. Okay. Well, anything else we should know about Boonesboro? I see the Bowman House is here. Uh, what is there about the Bowman House in Boonesboro?
Well, it's a historic log home, and it did, I guess it still does, house the Historical Society there. So, it's
You
just
know,
symbolic of how, in the past, Boonesboro's history goes.
and the thing about it is that many of the historical societies are having a hard time. So, I mean, I've been attempting to trace my mother's people in Livingston, Alabama, and I created a one-woman show on the first 100-year history of Livingston. So I've been calling and back and forth and talking. I stopped calling for a few years. I called back recently, and they weren't able to hold on. They had to close. They didn't have funding. So anytime you find a historical society that is still, has its vitality, it's still engaged with the community, it's still able to hold on.
Like the place we're in now.
Like the place we're in now, it's really a blessing. It's lucky. It's whatever you'd like to say, but I can tell you that it's not happening as much as it did. And
Part of the problem I've seen with a lot of the historical societies are the upkeep. They're in these historical buildings, and they have a lot of upkeep. I mean, think about what it costs to heat this place with the high ceilings,
yes,
the
I
big
love it.
rooms.
Oh,
Um, Other places I've seen where they've needed to go back and regrout brick because the old grouting in the brick is turning back to sand, things like that.
oh boy.
So you need to, and of course, like the one in Boonesboro, that's a brick home, and brick home. That's a log cabin.
I'm going to try to show this. I don't know how much the camera can pick up, but it's in the book. So,
So you've got to, regrout those logs. I guess you call it grouting. Those logs.
because that's really old. I mean, it looks old.
It is.
I mean, so I don't know. But I mean, I love the idea that they are doing something with it. And the next town we talked about, because we did talk before the show, is Funkstown. Now, I sure would love to know who was the man behind Funkstown.
Wow. Well, his name was Henry Funk, and he had big dreams, but bad timing. He had wanted Funkstown to be the county seat, and he campaigned for that. Of course, it went to Hagerstown, Then he left the county for a while to develop some property down in Montgomery County, and in the hopes of making that a success and a thriving community. And shortly after he gave up and left to come back here, they bought that property up to be part of what would eventually become DC. And so he just kind of he had these dreams that just kept getting thwarted. Um,
That so often happens with creative people. Have an idea, but timing is essential.
right.
So if you miss that, you know,
And then he eventually wound up leaving. I mean, he came back to Funkstown, but he eventually wound up leaving because he was still getting frustrated with his plans, and some may call them schemes. And so he left town to go south and kind of dropped off the radar. So no one's quite sure what happened to him down there.
so he left Boonesboro, went to Montgomery County, came back to, I'm sorry, he left from Funkstown and went to Montgomery County, came back, and then he went south, and no one heard from him thereafter.
Right. He went down to Kentucky in
Oh,
1791 with some other families who left the town. They were going to emigrate, I guess. At that time, 1791, that still would have been open frontier to try and develop. And he probably was going to try and develop a town down there.
he
Um,
probably was. He has that because he had that in his mind. He was a dreamer. He could and a visionary.
yes,
So he could see. He could see the whole layout. He could plan an entire city, or you know, an entire town. I mean, I can see that. I understand that kind of. You know, when you have a vision like that, you can plan every single piece of it. You know. So anyway, but we don't know what happened.
no,
So
he made nothing that I saw uh, talked about him after he left the area. And I didn't find any detailed records of him down in Kentucky, or any records actually of him down in Kentucky. Although they still may be there in some small historical society down
if
there.
it's still standing, if
Yeah.
it's still standing. Well, do you know why he? It seems that you've written here that he missed the chance to found the county seat of Washington County. Why was that important to him? He wanted it to be in Funkstown.
He wanted it to be in Funkstown because if it became the county seat, then you get all those municipal buildings built there.
Oh, that's true.
People have to come in for trials and to do business with the county, which means uh, you've got a strong chance of having a good economy in the
Mm.
county seat, or at least a stronger economy in the county seat versus, a town that's not.
And you know, I guess that is very important to the development of a new town. But they maintained his name, so it's
Right.
still Funkstown.
But
So,
consider how much larger Hagerstown is than any other town in the county,
well, that's true.
and how much more business it has than any of the other
That's very
towns.
true.
And by and large, that comes because it is the county seat.
Uh-huh.
The county seat attracts, businesses
Mm.
a lot, and it attracts a lot of businesses too, as well as people, because the businesses want to, particularly back then, if you could be closer to the places you would need to go to get permits and record land transactions, things like that.
You know, one of the things that you told me, because this is again visionary kind of things, but one of the things that you told me was that the capital of the country was at one time considered here in this area. That kind of surprised me. I don't think I knew that. You know, I was a world history instructor, but I was not an American history instructor. But nonetheless, I didn't think when I moved here that I was moving to a place that was considered at one time to be the nation's capital. Tell us about that story.
Well, it was, you know, Congress had, when they were looking for a place for the national seat, they had set some stipulations. The biggest one, at least where it concerns here, is it had to be within um, a certain distance of the river,
Oh,
Potomac River.
yes.
And so, kind of like being the county seat, these towns realized that if they could become the federal capital, they'd be even a bigger chance of being a success. So three of them put their hats in the rings, and but the final decision was left up to George Washington. He,
You know him.
yeah,
Yeah.
he actually really had his mind already made up where he wanted it down there near Mount Vernon.
Of course.
But he was kind of obligated to check everything out, and so he did make a trip up here. They had some nice events to welcome him and show off the different towns, things like that. And he was very gracious,
I'm sure. Yeah.
and he returned and made his decision, be down there by DC, which positive and negatives, to that decision,
Yes.
and to not being up here. I mean, but if it had been here, it really would have eventually by now it would have split Maryland in half
Mhm.
because the city's so large that, and Maryland is narrow here, it would have been able to slice it right in half.
I guess I'm thinking that this may give you an opportunity to write yet another book. George Washington slept here. You could join
Well,
all the other authors.
yeah, I was gonna say there's plenty of authors who have done stuff like that. There's probably, I would bet you, there's a book out there
Oh,
called George Washington Slept Here,
probably so.
because
Probably
there's
so.
plenty of places. I live up in Gettysburg. There's a place not far from there where he stayed when he was heading out to Western PA to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yes. Oh, he's dealing with the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah.
But we know, don't we, that at Mount Vernon,
Yeah,
he was making plenty of money by making. Would you say making whiskey? Wow.
distilling.
I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Distilling whiskey. Okay.
I guess he could probably afford the taxes
Well,
on it though,
oh, he probably could. Oh,
because that's
yes.
really what it was. It was a tax revolt.
Okay. So in other words, he didn't mind the whiskey. He just cared
Oh
about.
no! Oh yeah, yeah.
Why would I think that any man, of his stature would care about the whiskey? Because, but anyway, and so and speaking of that, I'm thinking of Fort Frederick because that's where I heard the story that George Washington slept here, that they thought he had come through a particular place um, there on the property that he rode through going towards the canal. So tell us.
He would have gone through there when he was a young aide de camp to General Braddock.
Yes.
So going out that way, yeah. But of course, there was no Fort Frederick back then, no C&O Canal at the time when he was going through. He was a young guy. I mean, Cumberland still has the headquarters where he was stationed down near the river, and then so he was kind of helping with the English. So America was still an English nation, and so a lot of the things you would affiliate with that area weren't around when he was coming through. But there is lost gold. General Braddock's lost gold is a big legend out that way and in Western PA.
Oh, so is that your next book?
I've written articles about it. And other people have written some books about it, but yeah, Braddock's expedition on the way to Fort Duquesne, ambushed, massacred, and the payroll in gold disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it.
Someone knows.
Okay, someone knows.
We just don't know who that someone is.
Those ghosts aren't talking.
No, they're not talking. Okay, so okay, so now we've gone through Fort Frederick. Is there anything in your book that will give us a little bit of the history of Fort Frederick? Because I find that fascinating, only because so many wars were fought there.
Exactly. That's the neat part about Fort Frederick. It participated in three wars, and it was essentially a prisoner of war camp at one point. It was the defensive fallback position if Indians attacked the settlers in the area. It served multiple functions, and the span of being involved in three wars is very interesting too, because By the time the Civil War came around, I mean, it was small compared to other forts at the time. It really would not have held up well under a strong Civil War bombardment. Even by then, artillery and weaponry had advanced to the point where, as a defensive place, it was essentially obsolete. But it was used to try and defend the C&O Canal should the Confederates come across up that way.
There was also an African American family there on the
They
property.
owned it.
They owned
Maryland
it.
bought it from them,
That's what I understand. The
which
Williams
is kind of
family.
interesting.
It is. It's
Wow,
extremely
yeah,
interesting.
I live over in the fort. I own it.
Right, I own it, and so and I'm sure that there are very few people that know anything about the fact that an African American man and his family were actually the ones who owned the fort and who sold it to the state of Maryland. Did they sell it? Okay.
Yes.
And and I understand that Mr. Williams also was a person who understood diplomacy because he was friends to both the Union side and the Confederate side. He allowed each of them to go through his property, whatever, and he apparently was, very welcoming. But I think he had a strategy there. I think it was to survive.
I was going to say, he didn't have much choice.
No,
You know,
no, he didn't. So
one man against an army.
uh,
Yes, you can't cross my property
that's right.
as they walk around
Right, but on second thought, if you really want to, it's okay. Okay. So what about the C&O Canal? Because I remember I gave historical tours of Washington, D.C., and I remember that we would stand there in Georgetown. I would have my busload of people get off, and they'd look at it, and I'd tell them, because at that time, I had no idea I would ever move here. And I would tell them, yes, and it goes from here in Georgetown, the canal goes all the way to Cumberland. That was just a thought in my mind. That was something I had read, but you actually have the history of that. So tell us a little bit about, are there any hidden things we should know about the C&O Canal?
Well, actually, I did a history, Secrets of the C&O Canal book.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
But when you were doing your history tours down there, did you ever point out that there's a canal house on Constitution Avenue where there's no canal?
Yes, there's what is it called? It's called not the, well, we weren't calling it the Canal House, but it's where they put the locks down. But
Lock
I
house.
did, the lock house, I did point that out, and I did tell them the person who lived there had a huge number of children, like 16 or 17
Oh,
children.
wow.
It was something like that. And that's what I remember about it.
Yeah, there used to be
Yes,
a canal, a short canal that went through DC connecting the C&O to the Anacostia. And it ran up what is now Constitution Avenue, and that's why the lock house is still there. But yeah, the C&O Canal has a very interesting history. I mean, it credits its origins to Washington, George Washington, although he was trying to build something totally different on the Virginia side. Um, but it started construction on the same day B&O Railroad started construction, and they were racing to get to Cumberland. That was the first major hub where the coal markets were, so they'd be
I
able to
see.
get a lot of business when they hit there. And just different Mother Nature delayed the canal, finances delayed the canal, and of course, the railroad and the canal people were trying to stab each other in the back. So court cases and things tied them up, and the railroad wound up getting to Cumberland 8 years before the canal did.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I so often, as I've given my own family history, which by the way, um, began there at Mount Vernon.
Okay.
And so, we would so often talk about the fact that people in that day traveled, and they traveled, long distances. And I always said, how in the world did they travel that far? What did they travel? Were they on horse and buggy? And someone pointed out to me and said, wait a minute, there were trains. I said, that far
Depends
down?
on how far back you're going.
Yeah.
The trains, really not until the early 1800s. Same thing with the canals, a little bit earlier. National Road, dawn of the what was that, dawn of the 19th century is when they started building the national road. Otherwise, it was just trails you were looking for, and the trails would not have been, a lot of them would not have been suitable really for buggies.
Um, that brings me to another point. For 5 years, I volunteered to be on the national, no, I'm going to say this incorrectly, but the National Maryland Road Committee. I was teaching in Baltimore at the time, and I would come from Baltimore up here to what I thought was way in another country, Hagerstown. Now look, I can't believe it. And we would meet, and sometimes we'd meet in Cumberland, which is a long way to
Well,
drive
that's
back.
really where the national road started.
But here's what I want to say. They didn't seem to know, or they weren't attempting to give credit to the fact that a lot of those trails were made by native people, and the other people just followed them. Am I right or wrong about
A
that?
lot of them would.
Oh, okay, so,
It depends on the road you're talking about. 15, for instance, over in Frederick County, runs down
uh-huh.
into Virginia and all. That was called the Old Carolina Road, and it was an Indian trail that eventually was used so much it developed into a formal road. So
So
I know that one for a fact.
okay, did you just say that the National Road began in Cumberland?
Yes, it started construction there. It was because it was right there at the cut in the mountain, so that you could, so they could develop this national road. Went to Ohio and or, Illinois. Went to Illinois. I believe it was Vandalia. Probably pronouncing the name wrong. And uh, that was a free national road. Now, eventually, because of its success, they started building it backwards towards Baltimore
I
and
was going to
Montgomery
say it
County.
goes all the way down to
Yeah,
Baltimore.
and that way it was developed more as turnpikes.
Yes.
So paid turnpikes, so different style. And it was not a national project like it was from Cumberland going west. But they built that road to help develop the West, to get the people through the mountains at the gap, and then to take them easily or as easily as you could go west.
And I'm just thinking there's so much history that's coming to my mind about people who were prominent during that time. And I guess it wasn't too difficult, I hate to say this, but to be prominent during that time because you had an idea. You probably were the first one to to think of what you could do with that particular area. Like now, you come behind all kinds of people, but think about it. Back then, you were like, I have an idea, and they say, what is it? Okay, we'll do it. You're the first one. You're going to become a prominent citizen. But I just, oh my gosh, that story, I could talk on and on
Rougher
about
way
the
to
national.
live back then. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Oh, yeah, that's true.
no indoor plumbing, no roads, so
No, that's
you
true.
really had to, uh, be willing to truly rough it for years as you developed land out here, for instance, like Funk,
Exactly.
or John Hager. They weren't developing, you know, an acre next to an existing town.
Exactly.
They were developing the town.
Right. I mean, it's exciting though. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you would live to do, to
Right?
start something
And it
brand
took a
new.
certain type of person, just like
Yes, it did.
the Western settlers when they would open up the land rush out there. You get your 160 acres free, um, but you had to be a certain type of person, and like the conditions there, you had to, what was it, stay on it for 5 years and work it for 5 years for it to actually be yours. So it took some fortitude.
Well, just that whole thing is fascinating to me, and only because I volunteered for those 5 years, I got to know a lot of the people that I'll bet I sort of forgotten, but I'll bet if I could see them and they're still working on that project, I would know, oh, so that's who you were. Oh, now I'm living here, so now I know. But the thing is, once the county became uh, one in which, well, was livable for one thing, then we had something else that happened. and that was the Civil War.
Right.
So now you are interrupted. I mean, you had a vision, saw it come to fruition, and now there's a war. So of course, here in this county, Antietam is the big story. We know where you are, Gettysburg. Of course, that is
Right.
they think of that as being the story, but we have Antietam here also, another big story. So how did that impact Washington County and become one of your little known stories?
Well, Antietam in itself wouldn't be a little known story, but
No.
like for instance, I wrote about the Daughters of Charity who were here um, taking care of the wounded after the battle and what they saw and wrote about, experienced here, and luckily they were fairly close, just in Emmitsburg, so it was about a day's ride away. But they came down, and just what they saw was tragic, and wound up giving away a lot of the food they brought to feed themselves while they were here because the soldiers were so in need of nourishment. Um, but the county here, the town here was ransomed during the Civil War, and where the Confederates came in and demanded money and goods and things like that. Otherwise, they were going to burn it, like they did Chambersburg. And
So terrible.
where the county's located on the Potomac River, I've always called the Potomac River the true Mason-Dixon line because, you know, to the south you had Virginia,
That's true. That's true.
and to the north you had Maryland, a Union state.
That's very true.
And so anytime the Confederate Army or the Union Army uh, made an incursion into the north or the south,
Uh-huh.
and you read about them crossing the Potomac rivers, they were also having to cross the canal pretty much, which meant a lot of damage happened to the canal just from the number of troops. Confederates liked to try and burn the locks to try and keep the coal from getting down or other types of grain and things. Um, there's an open water area where a short uh, place on the canal where the canal boats actually have to go into the river because it's just too narrow
Uh-huh.
and then come back into the canal.
Oh, true. Yes.
They would hijack boats there and take them across the river if they had grains and things. So it was, it was a treacherous time.
So, whatever happened to the Daughters of Charity?
Well, they were here probably, I would guess, about thinking 6 weeks after the battle, and essentially they were doing triage, caring as best they could for the soldiers until they could get shipped out to the behind the scenes hospitals, which a lot of were run by a lot of Daughters of Charity. And so, they were shipped to places like DC, Satterley Hospital in Philadelphia, over in Frederick, they had emergency hospitals set up in Cumberland, Clariesville, in that area. So they would get them on trains or wagons. Jonathan Letterman developed his triage and his ambulance system. I think they credit a lot of those developments being put into play for the first time here. So they would get those bodies loaded onto these ambulances, which were wagons with multi-level stretchers.
Yes.
And ship them, to the hospitals where they would be cared again by Daughters of Charity.
It's interesting because I'm trying to remember. I do honestly believe it was Gettysburg because I don't remember coming here to Antietam. But I portrayed a woman. And actually, she was an African American woman. Maybe you've heard her. And I'm just going to, please forgive me. All historians forgive me. I believe her first name was Lydia, but I can't remember the whole thing. This has been some time ago. Sorry. Anyway, it was a History Channel show, so I don't remember. But anyway, I was portraying her. And what she did was she rented a wagon and a horse, and she filled it with food, pies, bacon, all kinds of things. And she took it onto the battlefield, and she didn't mind whether you were Confederate or Union soldier. She gave them food, she gave them comfort, and she would ask them, did they want to have to write letters home? She would write it for them, and I never forget that. That was it. Just portraying her gave me a warm feeling that that people are people.
What's a good
That
example of how people step up when they were needed to?
exactly, exactly, and people, there's a need, and so you step up to it.
Kind of like the Rosie the Riveters in World War II, and
Exactly. Yes.
where the women stepped in to fill jobs that traditionally done by men, but the need was
The
there,
need was there.
and they got in there and did it. In some cases, it kind of damaged their health, like the women who used to paint the glow in the dark dials on watches for soldiers, and it was radioactive paint they were using, and they would, to get a point on their brush, put it in their mouth, and so a lot of them developed cancer because of that.
I never heard that before. So you're saying that the paint that was needed,
Had radium in it, I
had
believe.
but they didn't know that, I'm sure.
No, or well, they knew it was radium, but I don't think they realized at the
What it
time
would
the
do.
dangers
Yes, yes.
of radioactivity. I mean, I mean, right around the time they were developing the bomb, that's when this radiation would have started becoming prominent about what it could do.
Well, this is history. History has many things that
Yeah.
we don't catch up to in the beginning of what's going on. We just sort of come to it, and when we learn about it, then of course it's a little late. But
A lot of pioneers of science wind up dying. I saw a picture once. It's an amazing picture of a one cop shooting another cop to test a bulletproof vest, one of the first bulletproof vests. Now, how do you think that cop felt? It's like, you know,
well, when that happens, I've often wondered when it hits the repellent, the vest that you wear. Do you still feel the
oh
shot? You
yeah,
have to.
you get bruised and
Oh no,
you knock down, and I mean, it's still got all that kinetic energy
velocity.
behind it.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh.
but I'm just thinking, what were they using back then? Because it wasn't Kevlar.
I know.
I mean,
A lot of padding, maybe.
it looked like a picture from the 1920s. So it's like, what materials would they have had back then to use, and what would have convinced me to put one on to let somebody shoot me?
Uh, they'd have to do a lot of talking, a whole lot of talking. I see Dorothea Dix is mentioned here. What was her role in the with the Sisters of
She
Charity
kind
or
of
Daughters?
she didn't like the Daughters of Charity as well. It made,
Oh, oh,
um, but she was employed by the Union Army to run their nursing corps, um, and she had these rules that you could the women had to be under 30. They had to be plain looking. They couldn't wear fancy jewelry and things like that because she didn't want
working with the men.
women working with men who were trying to look for a
Yes,
husband.
yes.
And so the Daughters of Charity kind of fit that description, but she also was very anti-Catholic, so she didn't want any Catholics, let alone Daughters of Charity. But the governments wanted Daughters of Charity because they were pioneers in healthcare. They had been in healthcare since 1823, and they knew what they were doing, or as well as anybody back then. And they were hardworking, and so um, Secretary of War Stanton gave them their own authority. They were autonomous from Dorothea Dix, which I'm sure she didn't like much because apparently the doctors preferred Daughters of Charity over Dorothea Dix's nurses.
I'm just noticing that in your book, you give quite a bit of time of research to this entire business of nuns on the battlefield. And I just think, golly gee, I went to I was at a Catholic school. I was, raised, you'd say I wasn't Catholic, but I was raised there from kindergarten through middle school. And I'm thinking about them and things that, must have been true of what was going on at that time. And to think that they were on the battlefield, 700 Catholic sisters, that's a lot of people, and that's a lot for women, I would think, to bear up to. But of course, they had the order that they were coming as a mission from God, probably. I'm not sure, but that's
Well,
some.
it had been incorporated into their mission as a sisterhood, as well as caring for the poor and providing education. They incorporated, taking care of the sick. But all the 700 weren't there in one location.
They were.
They were spread out,
Uh-huh.
various hospitals, battlefields, north and south, pretty much every state. So you might only get, there were only two that were sent here. That was all they could spare at the time after Antietam, and they worked themselves to the bone. Um,
Yes. Well, I guess that was their mission, so that's what they did. I see you're talking also about the second battle of Antietam. Why did you distinguish the the battle into two? What second
the
battle?
Second Battle of Antietam, after World War One, Blackjack Pershing, the general from World War One, had been so impressed by the Marines fighting in Europe that he wanted to disband the Corps and put them into the Army. And he was pushing for that, but Generals Lejeune and Butler, who were diehard Marines, of course, they wanted to continue the Corps. So that's when they developed essentially a PR campaign to show their worth to the public. That's when the Marine Corps started celebrating their birthday, that they continue to do. When a lot of the stories were developed about how different parts of their uniform relate to their history. But the big thing they did was starting in 1921, instead of doing their summer maneuvers at a isolated place, they started using Civil War battlefields. They would march to the battlefield and they would do historical and modern reenactments on the battlefield.
Oh, that's it. I'm glad you brought that up. Keep going because I have
And
a
then
question for
and
you.
then they would and then they would have different classes during the time they were there as well. So in 1924, they marched up to Antietam. They, about a quarter of the Marine Corps marched from Quantico up through D.C., Montgomery County, Frederick County,
Mm.
over the mountains, came down, and they set up a camp on the battlefield because that back then the War Department controlled the Civil War battlefields, so you could do things like that actually on the battlefield. And then did um, they did historical reenactments where they invited the public out. And after the historical reenactments, they did a modern version of the battle where they would use planes and
My goodness.
signal balloons and tanks and
They,
machine guns, all that kind of stuff.
they really got into it, what you're saying.
Well, and that was, part of their training exercise.
Mhm.
When they did the historical thing, they had to kind of follow the way history went with the different charges and things and who won. When they do it, the modern version, it was up in the air.
Well, listen, I was a Civil War reenactor. I soon became a first person because I was not going to stay out all night, and all that. That didn't happen. But what do you think? This is a personal philosophy now. But what do you think about having all of the reenactments? I mean, you've studied it to the extent that you've been able to tell us in your books about the various battles and the little known histories. So tell me, what do you think about reenactments as a way to educate the public?
I think they're fine because um, it catches the attention of people, and you're not going to be able to educate them unless you can first catch their attention. I know when I moved to Gettysburg and my family went to one of the reenactments. Um, After or in between, we were able to go back to the encampments and talk to the soldiers, and they start getting almost into a living history presentation like you were doing, where they
Yes.
would start telling us, about their equipment or their uniforms, or um, more about the battle, perhaps the regiment that they portrayed, things like that. And those reenactors, they do know the
Oh,
history
oh
of
boy, do they.
related to their whatever they're reenacting.
Yes, they do. Yes, yes, yes. The only reason I got into it was because there was someone from the Massachusetts, 54th, I think, Massachusetts, and one of the men there thought that it was time to have women come in and show the responsive behavior that they had, their desire to help the soldiers. And so that's how our group got started.
And it
And
helps,
boy, let me tell you, do they know the history of the
right?
Civil War? But my point is, and I guess I wanted to ask you about it, and I guess I want to add for our listening and viewing audience too. Um, what do you think? I mean, I remember Mother Teresa saying, I think I shared this with you, that if you, when you want to talk about peace, invite me to a peace rally, but don't invite me to a war rally because I'm not going to come. And I'm just wondering, I know we need to capture their attention. Believe me, as a world history instructor, I can tell you really have to capture, because otherwise they're like this. Oh no, more they're like this. They have their phones. They have them in classrooms now. Okay, you have to take them from them, but they have them. So I'm just thinking, are we doing the public a favor? Are we really engaging them in ways to have peace by always showing them the confrontation between two sides?
Civil War reenactors, I would say, it's not necessarily about peace. I mean,
No, it's not.
it's about the Civil War and the battles that were fought, the strategies used, and the reasons they fought it. Um, but I'm sure they also probably do reenactments at Appomattox Courthouse, which where they surrender. Uh, you know,
I mean, but the surrendering may not necessarily, well, it didn't bring peace. I was going to say it may not bring peace, but I'm just thinking, how do we? Is there any way to present it and bring forth people like, and I do remember her name now, Lydia Hamilton Smith. I'm sorry, those people who love Lydia, I'm just remembering her name. The African American woman that brought food and everything to Gettysburg, all of the truth. Okay, so anyway, I'm just wondering though. Is there some way of showing that type of humanity? Because believe me, now when I was doing the reenactment, the officers of the Confederacy, I think sometimes they get hung up in their role, and I don't know that. I mean, what can we do to show that? Okay, so these two sides were fighting back in the day, but how can we then mend this? With people like Lydia, and there were others.
well, part of it, has to go down to understanding. Like, for instance, to understand the humanity of what Lydia was doing, you need the war in contrast. You know,
That's true.
Without the war, she's out of context, and it's like you don't really get the understanding. But when you know what happened at Gettysburg, what the fighting that was happening, particularly since you said she was taking it to both sides,
She was.
regardless, and given that a lot of the Confederates were slaveholders, you know
Yes,
that even emphasizes her humanity.
that's right.
But if you take that away, which is part of the problem, now with the argument over uh, taking away the Confederate memorials and things, especially on a battlefield.
Yes.
So then you only have Union memorials. Okay, who were they fighting? You lose that half of the story, and then everything's out of context, and the people, then you're going to lose people right away because they're just not going to understand. You know, Now if you want to, put things in context, that's well and good, and it helps. But you've got to, present both sides of any argument so that people understand what that side's position was, why they were against the other side's
Uh-huh.
position, and vice versa. And, examining, reasons why one side triumphed over the other or why they were able to reach an agreement.
And I do really think that that is where both statues and memorials should be on the battlefield. That does, it's instructional then. You can see, what exactly what happened. So I agree with you there. There's no reason that I didn't have any idea that they were trying to pull the Confederate statues away from like Gettysburg or
Here, I know,
I
in
mean, but
Tatum, they talked about it.
really,
One of the congressmen was talking about it when it was a real big issue. It's not so big anymore, but one of the congressmen, Delaney, I think it
uh-huh, uh-huh.
was talking about having a chair. I don't know how far it went since, but I know Gettysburg, the superintendent of the park was like, no way,
Mhm.
But even now, I mean, there are things that the Gettysburg Park ignores that people don't understand things that happened there. There was a POW, a German POW camp during World War II on that battlefield. The first tank training camp in the country was on that battlefield, and the Park Service virtually ignores those pieces of history, and so you don't, you're missing some of the,
I agree with you on that point. I do, and I think also that maybe more should be brought forward that shows some because there. I have to say this because it's coming from my perspective and many other people there too.
okay,
Is that so few moments are captured where African American soldiers were actually fighting in the war. You don't when you think of Antietam and Gettysburg, you don't really think of United States colored troops,
right.
but they were around. They were doing their part, and I think we have to do something about it. Um, I hope someone's listening out there because I started a United States colored troops reenactment group in my school, and they were high school students, 11th and 12th graders, and I think that we have to do that to teach that
Well,
we were all there.
definitely, yes, that story has to be told as well.
It
Um,
does.
but there has to be a certain balance, I guess I would say. Um, for instance, uh, if someplace like what was that?
Oh, okay.
The one place where the 54th Massachusetts fought that the movie Glory's about,
Uh-huh. Is it Savannah?
somewhere down south.
Somewhere
So you would
south.
expect the story of the color troops that, and particularly that unit, to be a big part of that battlefield because they played a big
Yes,
part.
they did.
But say up here in Tito,
Yeah.
where they weren't a major part, they were a part, so definitely tell their story.
Uh-huh.
But um, now it's almost like that's, in some cases, that's the only side or only portion of the story. So that if somebody's coming to a battlefield and that's all they're reading about, they won't realize that, they'll think, wow, this battle was fought just by this unit of the
Right.
color troop and miss that. Again, it's all about context.
Mhm.
Same thing with the women's stories that they need to be told too,
That's
because
right.
like the Daughters of Charity or Clara Barton and Red Cross or Dorothea Dix and the nurses, the army, those stories need to be told because they saved number one, they saved a lot of lives, but
Indeed, they did.
they were, you know, they they were a big part in the aftermath, and uh, it's one of those things that also gets overlooked that needs to be told.
One of the parts of the story of the 54th that I'm saying this because I want you to tell me what you know about this, is that I understand when they came into the town. I'm so sorry, forgive me, I cannot remember exactly where they were, but all of my friends are going to hate me for this. But anyway, they came into the town, and because they were Masons, some of them, that they kind of had a pass to go in, to come into the town and whatever. What do you know about the foundation or the Masons
I know a little bit
in
about
this
them,
in this in Washington County?
not a ton in Washington County, but
Oh,
it's a brotherhood. You know,
It is.
So essentially, I know, for instance, when one of the stories, excuse me, one of the stories when they burned Chambersburg was that the Masonic Lodge was spared because
Mhm.
the Confederate general in charge was a Mason.
Uh-huh.
So there are, stories like that you find where, kind of trumps, that Masonic Brotherhood trumps
Seems
your
to.
affiliation, whether you're North or South.
That's true.
Um, there's stories, for instance, it's kind of along the lines of where brothers or relatives meet up on the battlefield and they refuse to fight each other because that blood is thicker than,
Sure.
where you live sort of ties.
That's hard to understand. It's hard to understand that brothers were fighting each other, due to the way that the lines, delineated one city from the other,
Right.
one part to the other. I don't understand. But here we have now, we've gone through a great deal of Washington County history leading up to the Civil War, and then we think everything is fine, and then the British, again, we see them, they're coming back, and we haven't talked about Washington County War of 1812.
Well, that was before the
That
Civil
was
War.
before the Civil War. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, now I'm looking really crazy on it. But okay, so let's talk about that's what am I thinking? 1812. That's right. So tell us about that.
Well, they didn't fight here, but troops were raised here,
Mm-hmm.
and they went and they fought and defended Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
And this was also the first place where the poem that became the Star Spangled Banner
Yes, or right over there.
was published
Right.
first in this county,
Mm.
which I thought was a really neat little nugget I found when I
I
was
think so
researching
too.
the War of 1812.
Mm-hmm.
The poem was called "The Defense of Fort McHenry," and they eventually was put the song. So
Well, yes, we remember that one very well. So, it's just that, there's so much history. I don't know how you even can put it in. See this book? First of all, it's readable. It's readable because it's something that you can pick up. You can look at it and say, "Oh, I can do this," because most people can't read books that are like, this thick. They want
well,
something that they can handle and they can read through it, have the conversations about it, and enjoy.
and the other thing is it's multiple stories, so
Yes.
you don't have to settle down for an hour
Oh,
to get something out of it.
because to tell you the truth, what's happening now is that we have a lot of history on YouTube. So people who are writing must keep this in mind that when you write something, please keep in mind, look what James Rada did. Try to do the same thing. Keep your books so that people can handle them, that they can take them out, for an evening. In fact, do you think you could read this in a day or two?
I would think so.
I think so too, if you really want, because it's very interesting. I'm looking through it. It's extremely interesting. Everything here is something that if you live in Washington County, and even if you don't live in Washington County, you'll enjoy this book. And the reason being, there's so many little stories, just as he said. Now, there's a man that we have not talked about, Kennedy, and let's sort of talk about him a little. Oh no, I just happened to see Making Mountain Dew, but we'll come back to that. But okay, but but talk about Mr. Kennedy and what is the story there on him?
Well, Thomas Kennedy was famous for championing
Mhm.
what was called the Jew Bill in Maryland to get the Jews the right to vote and representation um, in the legislature. And despite it being defeated, I mean, he kept fighting for it until it was eventually passed.
Mhm.
And and the interesting thing is Maryland was founded on the idea of religious freedom because as a primarily Catholic state when
Yes,
it
it
was
was.
founded, the Catholics faced a lot of bias from the Protestants around the in other states, and yet they turned around and showed the same sort of bias towards the Jews in the state. And so Thomas Kennedy stepped up.
What was his background? What was behind his motivation to do such a thing, to actually step forward with a bill like that? Do you know? I mean, I'm not putting you on the spot because you might not know. I just wondered.
Yeah, I'm not recalling right now.
Okay.
I would guess just a sense of, I mean, he obviously was not Jewish himself. He was a Scotsman. But just a sense of fairness, a sense of Maryland living up to its, one of its founding principles. And, he was a newspaper publisher, so he probably had a desire to fight for the underdog.
Yes, and he also knew a good story. He knew how the elements that maybe he looked at and thought, okay, this is fair. I've looked at all of the reasons why it should happen, and I'm going to do it. You never know. I always told my students that whatever you're reading, whatever history you're reading, always know that it's going to be personal for the historical characters that are involved. It may look as if it's for the county, it may look as if it's for the city, it may look as if it's for the state, but you really get behind the scenes, it's personal in some way. And so maybe he had Jewish friends or someone who had impacted his life.
Well, he probably ran into a lot of them as a publisher because
I'm sure he did.
A lot of them would have been merchants and probably advertisers in his publication. So he would have had that contact with them to know that
it's personal.
These weren't demons or devils running around.
Right.
They were just friendly people who trying to get by and worship God in their own way. But they weren't discouraging other people from worshiping God in their way.
No, they weren't. I think that first of all, I love your book. I can just see this. I love your book. In fact, when I first met you, you were there at the Peach Fair. Leitersburg Peach Fair. And I was there, and I saw you with all of your books, and you had a beautiful smile. And I said, I'm going to go over and talk to him and see what he's doing with his books. And here you are. Now you're being interviewed, and it's going to be on YouTube, so eventually you'll see it there too. And I think, though, that what we want to do is to end on something. There were peaches were in everything. There was peach ice cream.
Yeah. Oh.
There was peach, I don't know, something peach to drink. There were peaches,
peach tea. Pies, of course.
So I think we're going to end this by looking at other things that one might drink. And I'm looking at your chapter on making Mountain Dew, White Lightning, hooch, and moonshine. Let's have something to laugh about. We've been talking about some very heavy subjects. So let's talk about something that's a little lighter.
South Mountain, Catoctin Mountain, well-known places. There were reports that within a couple miles of Hagerstown, there were 500 stills during Prohibition.
Well, I mean, and what I don't understand is listen, I'm thinking about the Andy Griffith Show. This was my grandmother's favorite show. Now, she was raised in Meridian, Mississippi, and maybe some of the people on Andy Griffith's show reminded her of people that she'd grown up with, that she had seen in the towns or the little cities and all, or in Meridian. But I'll never forget the show on the moonshine, the still, right? And how they were looking for someone who had done something. Andy and Barney, who I love Barney, were doing something to try to find out what was going on. I think they felt that Andy's son had been accused of starting a fire. But anyway, they found out eventually that it was a still that they were looking for. So, I mean, what did that do for the economy? What was it just a matter of, okay, they won't let us do it legally, so we're just going to,
essentially, it was a matter of the government passing a law that the people just outright refused. And they ran it themselves. And Penmar was notorious for it because people would come from the city to relax up there, and it's up there in the mountains, so it's close to stills to start with. And there are stories about people who would leave their hotel to go take a walk through the woods or whatever, and there'd be a guy set up there with a table selling moonshine, and he'd sell it till it ran out, then pack up his table, disappear into the woods,
Oh,
and reappear a couple hours later at a different location with a brand new supply of moonshine.
oh,
And
God.
then, of course, there was the fun story I found of a couple guys who bought some moonshine. They thought they had a great deal. You know, it was going for about $20 a pint back then, and uh, these guys managed to get this moonshine for like $3 a pint. They thought they hit the jackpot. Turned out it was muddy water.
Oh, no.
So there were scams being run back then, and they couldn't complain. You can't go to the police about it because you were buying illegal moonshine.
Mm. Well, all I know is my my stepfather lived in Pound, Virginia, which I think is not very far away. It's kind, because in the mountains, I don't know how it goes, but somehow you're 1 minute you're in Maryland, then you're in West Virginia. Well, he said it was West Virginia, and then next thing you know, you're in Virginia. It's all sort of.
Oh, that would have been right around Harper's Ferry somewhere
Oh, well, let me tell you. And he, had us all laughing about the things that would happen uh, up in the mountains, and some people that would come up there to investigate things they were doing, but they never came back. I'm sorry, Jim. Where I know you're
then.
in heaven right now, but I
Those,
just had to tell that story.
those moonshiners got the revenuers.
Didn't they? And he would tell the story. He would tell us that we were little dying laughing.
Well, that's where NASCAR got its start during
Really?
Prohibition, because those drivers had to learn to, drive fast and drive over treacherous terrain, and essentially they became racers.
Uh-huh.
And after it became legal again, they just continued racing.
Wow. This has been just a delightful time to spend with you. And gee whiz, there's still more. I want you to know this is a small book, but it is jam-packed with all kinds of stories. So you really could sit here and talk with him for maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours. But I'm sure that you've learned something today, and I hope that that you will purchase the book. Can you tell us about your book, where we can find it?
Oh, you can get, I know Turn the Page in Boonesboro carries it.
Oh, okay.
Um, the Arts Council here in Hagerstown carries some of my books. Any bookstore can order it. It's carried by national distributors. Of course, the online platforms, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, places like that have it. Or you can get it from my website, jamesrada.com.
Very good. Thank you. So please don't forget us. This program is coming to you from Tolson's Chapel, their historic chapel and school. And if you want to donate to keep programs like this going, please don't forget us, tolsonschapel.org. We want to thank the people here at the Miller House, and we hope that you'll come and see their exhibits. They are open. I'm sure they're open from 9 or something until 5 in the evening, and I'm sure they would love for you to come, or at least call them and find out when you can come, in case you have to make a special appointment for groups or whatever.
It is a lovely, surprisingly large
I know.
house.
It is. It's gorgeous. And when you come in and they're setting up for Christmas, I see it now, but I wish, well, we'll have to come back. I think we'll have to come back with someone and sit here where we could be a part of all of the decorations. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm ZSun-nee Miller Matema, and I'm glad to be with you. I'm the host here of Bright Talk. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.